And we can now start to translate the identities into equations that we will use. So the first column of production is what gives the GDP definition from the demand side and the income side. Here I have gross value added only from the income side. And here again, when choosing how to write your identities, you're also choosing some type of theory. So a mainstream would have the supply side being at the core, and then some type of adjustment from the demand side. In post-Keynesian models, we have the demand side as determining GDP, and then we have income distribution, and we will have to make a decision on income distribution. So the other things we can get from the transaction matrix are the determination of disposable income of the private sector, which would be the column for the private sector in the matrix. Well, the definition of saving and net lending for the private sector. For the government, we have the equivalent of the disposable income, so the money flowing in less the money paid out, and the definition of surplus and net lending of the government. And finally, the current account will give us the current account balance and the net lending position of the country. So these are all accounting identities we will need to include. Then we make a simplifying assumption that we can remove maybe later on to consider private expenditure as a whole as the sum of consumption and gross capital formation, consumption and investment. This will imply that we don't have a separate variable for investment, and therefore we don't have a separate variable for the stock of capital. We will need a measure of the government investment, and this will be something which creates some little trouble, because in the national accounts, government investment is included in total investment. And we want to separate that from private investment. So we will need to make these adjustments to the data. So the equations we will have so far are basically only 8 from the transaction matrix, since this is a simple model. And in addition, we can link the stocks to the flows by accounting identities, because at historical costs, without taking the net capital gains into the picture, we have to have that the net assets, the net financial assets of each sector grow over time with the net lending or net borrowing of the sector. And this will also imply that the sum of the net wealth of the 3 sectors must be 0. So notice that we have a missing equation here, because in the transaction matrix, we have that the sum of the 3 net lendings is 0, but I have not listed this identity in my final model. And this would be what Gottlieb called the hidden equation, or the missing equation. So it has to be verified by the other 8 equations, and you don't need to include that specifically into the model. Although if you do, it will be overdetermined. And the same for the balance sheet. So these 3 identities imply that the sum of the 3 net wealths is 0. You don't need to have this into the model specifically. So next step is So this was number 4. So we already got to number 5. And here we still have to prepare our data set. We saw how to do that. And now we have to start using the code. Did I show you? Yes. So it is now time to install your version of Eviews and to start looking at how these things work. So let me know when you have succeeded in installing Eviews. And hopefully you should have the same version I'm using, version 12.
Yeah.
So I understand that you are familiar with R. Some of the features of Eviews are similar to those of R. One is that you have separate windows, and the top window is where you can type comments. But one of the strengths of Eviews is that you can do most operation with menus, and in this capture window, Eviews will translate your menu command into code so that you can copy the corresponding code into a program. Now, the first thing you want to do when you work with Eviews is to create what is called a work file, which I guess would be a data frame in R. So we usually never create a data work file, an empty work file, but we read a set of data. But it's useful to look at what are the options for work files that you get by using file new work file. Is Eviews running on your computers? Installing now. Okay, so I'll try to go very slowly. And basically the work file is where you place your data, models, estimates, everything. And it is usually arranged for time series data, but you can also have an unstructured work file with no time index if you want to work with a survey. And you can also have a work file structured for panels. You usually work with dated work files. And next, you need to specify the frequency of your data, which, as we said, we will use quarterly data. Now, in most recent versions, you can have also intraday data. And you can specify, you should specify a start date and an end date. And and optionally a name for your work file and a name for a page in your work file. Pages in work files are roughly the same things as sheets in spreadsheets. But what we will be doing is to open our file of data directly. So before I get there, I want you to have Eviews installed so that you can follow what I'm doing.
Just to the others who have university-issued laptops, are you having trouble getting the administrator rights?
Yeah.
I am there, so maybe I can. I'm doing it. Maybe Gennaro, we need 5 minutes to set this up, and
Okay.
then we continue.
Okay.
It's okay for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, not yet. I'm trying to do it in a virtual machine. But,
It's not working?
not working right now.
There's no Apple version of Eviews, huh?
No, there's a version 11, that's the one I have, but not the 12. But the serial number is not working.
There's a free version that is maybe working with Mac, or it's working with Mac, but I think free version, will it open these files? Can we?
No.
No.
The free versions does not run problem. So as I said, it's pretty useless. Anyway, what I can illustrate what I'm doing with Eviews, and immediately afterwards we can do the same thing with R that you can use. You do have RStudio installed, do you? Okay. So what I will do first is to open my data file. It's a foreign data because it's a spreadsheet. And here in Eviews, you have the equivalent of the working directory of R. And if you select this button, you can change your working directory. Right now, I don't need to change this because it's already where I want it to be. And I can select the file I want to read. And the procedure is similar as far as I remember in R. Now, Eviews tries to understand what type of data I want to read. And it finds that the last time I opened the file, it was on the data sheet of the spreadsheet, finds the data are in columns, allows you to switch to data in rows if needed. Then I can specify if I have headings in the first rows, and if so, what type of information is in the headings. So here I have the name of the variables. And finally, I can tell Eviews what is in these columns, but Eviews should understand by itself that there are numbers, with the exception of the first column, which includes dates. So it understands this is a time series data file with a frequency, the quarterly frequency. And it will create this work file using as the name of the work file up here, the same name of my Excel file, as the page name down here, the same name as the work file. And here I have all these V's, which are my columns. And I will have to tell Eviews what is that we are talking about here. And as I said, if I click on capture, I have the code which corresponds to the command for opening the file. So what you want to do is to create a new program and type the code that you are creating into this program. Now, I already started doing this, so I will show you the steps I've already taken. And the first thing is my working directory, is a called folder. And in Eviews, the % before the name of a variable specifies it's an alphanumeric variable. So we put whatever things need to be changed by colleagues at the top of the code. This is a good coding practice. Now, this code would not work on your machines because it's specific to my own computer. But if you change the folder where your data are located in this line, everything else will work. So you will need to change the following line. The hyphen here serves for comments. And I used, instead of opening the data, I used the work file create command because this allows me in an easier way to specify a name for the work file, a name for the page I will be working with, the frequency of the data, the start of the data, and the end. Now, the main difference here is that when I read a data file, as I did a few minutes ago, Eviews extends the sample of the work file to the last observation it finds in the spreadsheet. But I want to be able to make predictions for the future. So if I want to make predictions up to 2025, I need to extend the work file to the last date for which I will want to have predictions. Now, here I've created 2 pages for quarterly data, and this is because I will not need these 6,700 variables. I will only need maybe 30. So I'm copying everything in one page, and then I will be selecting the variables I want in the other page. So here I have to specify which file to import, and I do that by using a file name which starts with the working directory and then uses the file name. And here, this is basically what I had automatically from my command up here, is how to read the data file. This is another data file, by the way. This is why what you've read is different. And specifies the frequency and reads the data. Now, I'm using this other data that I prepared before. I'm not using the data file we have prepared this morning, but you should have this file available on the drive. And if not, I'm going to copy it immediately because I think that I have updated this file, adding the 3rd quarter, which was not there before. So this list here is the drive that I've shared with you. So now you should have this CEE file available. But the CEE,
But I'm not sharing with them the same link, the same drive.
The same drive.
Because the one that you sent to me was yours, and I couldn't share it with other person without your permission. So I had to create a new one.
Okay, so you have to copy this to.
Or you send it per email to
Yes.
the whole group if you want. If it's a single file, you can send it
Yes.
through email. It should be quite fast.
Anyway, it's exactly the same file that we prepared this morning. Only I removed the sheet containing everything. So let me check the file we were working with this morning. And this also has information up to the third quarter. So if you prefer, we can modify the code so to read this file and not my other file. So what I need to do is simply to I don't see the file on my drive. Oh, here it is. Okay.
Gennaro, excuse me, I'm trying to do this with the R code.
I will do it in a few seconds with R. Okay. So BD. Cuentas institucionales. This hopefully will work. Let's move to our studio. In our studio, we do practically the same thing. We need to open some libraries. I'm not sure we need all of them, but it's good to have at least these ones that I've listed here. ReadXL should be helpful in reading Excel files. And Zoo should be helpful for working with time series. And this BMETS is the package that handle models. Now, I have also shared these files with you, but after I shared them, I completed them. So we will have to circulate these files again. So as you can see, some things are common. Here I have created my working directory specific to my computer. And I read my data from here. But in R, I did something much simpler, because what I need to do in Eviews, what I need to do somehow before we build the model, is to take these 6,700 variables and extract only the variables we want. Now, I can obviously do this with R, but since I'm no expert in R, it would take me a rather long time. Since I am an expert of Eviews, it didn't take me that long to do that in Eviews. So what I did was to select the variables in Eviews, prepare a new spreadsheet with only model variables, and feed this into R. So I'm afraid that we will have to go through this in Eviews first. But meanwhile, have you solved some of the problems? Yes.
Could you share this Mexico data XLS?
Sure.
File? Because that's probably what we need for the R.
It will be needed for R, yes. But that should be available in.
It's not in our version.
Yeah, it's not.
Okay, so I will also share this Mexico data. This Mexico data is as a simpler structure. This is the structure of Mexico data. But here I already substituted the V's with the name of the variables we will be using in the model. Now, the problem I have with this course is that most of the work has already been done and is very boring. So if I did this work with you, you would not going to like my classes at all. The Mexico data is now in the folder I shared, but I'm not sure that you obtained it. I added a file.
The same, okay.
I added this Mexico data file. I hope those at home are following what is happening. That they're also installing Eviews and getting copies of these new files.
So I share the whole folder again. Okay.
Okay, so reading the data is the first necessary step. Next one would be to look at the data. And this is something I always stress many times, that we all rely on more or less menus from a software or code copied from some colleague to run our project. And it's very important that we check that the data we read have been read as expected. Once happened to me that PhD students came with the outcome of a regression, and she had this table which should have been read by rows, and she had read it by columns, and her regressions didn't make any sense, and she was not understanding why. And it's just because the numbers were random, they were not the variables were meant to be. So you need to visualize what you're doing. The name of the new file for the data is Mexico data.
No, I think Alessandro is sharing it.
Yep.
Right? Wait, is it online already or
No.
no? So in a minute it will be
So it's going to appear. So before we get to look at that file in R, we need to go through the steps that guided me to produce that file. So we want to start from the balance sheet, and we want to accumulate the flows starting from a benchmark value. You're still struggling with Eviews? Because Mexico data will be needed later, actually, when we work with R. Before we get there, we want to do a number of other steps. So basically, what we need to do is to understand how we move from this huge list to the small list of variables we need. So we can start with the balance sheet position. So we want to compute what I did for the simple table for one period. We want to do that for the whole time series for all the quarters. But when I started doing this, I discovered that there was a problem, and I have hopefully exemplified this in this little table. So here for the fourth quarter of 2020, I've computed the net assets of all sectors for all different type of assets. And then I've taken the row labeled as net assets, but this is not the sum of the assets in each category. And there is a row called discrepancy, and the discrepancy is rather large. And the discrepancy does not allow you to understand exactly where all these billions should go. So the problem is that if you don't add the discrepancy, the sum of the, so this is the okay, so these are the assets. They are all struggling with code, with software. Yes. Okay, so let's have a 10 minutes break.
Right. So the current stand of the things is that I will now send the link with the actual folder. The other one was too quick. I forgot to actually include the folder. With this, the file it's called, so the file that we need now, it's called Mexico. Be sure that I'm sharing the correct one. It's Mexico data.lsx. Okay, so I'm sharing that one.
That's what the R users will need.
Yes.
For the user, exactly. Right, and then we add it.
And I think there was also an updated file for Eviews, right?
I'm sorry?
For the Eviews, was there also one file that needed to be updated?
No, we can use the one we produced this morning. I will modify the code, and you have to modify the code following what I'm doing.
So, no, all right.
I also copied, well, there are two R codes that I copied now, and that they are different from what I shared last week. So you should make sure these are Mexico model and Mexico model 2. There are slides number 6 and 7 that I didn't share last week and that I shared now. And Mexico data, and also should be, I don't know whether you have the other one, which is this GDP OECD. No, so I need to share this as well. So I also want to share this GDP underscore OECD XLSX with everyone else. Hopefully, this should be the last one that needs to be shared.
There's another file. Or could we get a link for this? This is also Google Drive, right?
Yeah, but this is what I would need. I can maybe that send separately only that file.
Change the permission standard.
I cannot do that. And then I think you should include all the email. Okay, just make. All right, yeah. Okay, but the last that I sent is there, right? With the Mexico file for the R users. Can you please check that?
Yeah, Mexico data is there.
All right, yeah. Yes, one we have it. Then we need this one GDP OECD. Okay, let's get it.
And we did go later to step by step in our like upload the Excel later.
Es gibt im Folder Mexiko noch OECD. Ja, genau das. Das ist OECD. Das ist andererseits müsste man den wahrscheinlich hervorholen, damit man das einfach per Code rausziehen kann. Ja?
I think it's more practical. You can send me a list of the emails of everyone.
Yeah. Or can you change the status of the folder from share on the image to access to everybody who has only the link? That should be possible as well.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, now you're going to the last Excel file with this video.
Now everyone should be able to access this folder.
Okay, and we have to share the link.
Which link should we use?
Exactly. Now, exactly. This is now.
Should I
You can
send it?
copy the link.
Well, it's too complicated. I will send it to you.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, just with different permissions.
It's the same link, right? Okay. So,
Did you already access it, Benjamin?
I think he has to send it because he also had what he already has the link.
all right. Are you sure?
You got-
It's the same link, right?
Just change the conditions.
Okay.
No, it's not from the list.
No, that's not. Because I couldn't change the status of this one, so that's why I had to make another Google Drive to share it with you.
And that one,
Now we can change
Now we change the status of his own one, and I can send it to everybody.
So I sent it to everybody.
Exactly. Perfect.
So hopefully now, if I copy another file, it should be available
Should be automatically.
automatically.
Yeah, great.
So what about Eviews? Those who with a university computer cannot install it.
Apparently, my administrator rights works only with my own computer, so I have the power to install new software here, but not in other laptops.
and how did you set them? I think that's good, right?
But here is working.
Or do you need one?
But does the computer allow you to install or not?
I think the ones with the university, just tomorrow in the morning before we start.
Yeah.
So that today I don't see option for us to do it very quickly.
Yeah,
Sorry.
probably I can install new software on my own machine, but not on another machine.
So I just visited the IT. So those with university computers send an email to IT hotline with software you need to be installed. And then there's only these two students and they know nothing. But maybe they can do it remotely. We should do it right now so that we at least may have it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Sorry, this should have been done before, but I wasn't aware.
What's the asset and how to do?
No, you have admin rights on your computer, do you?
It's just like a serial number is not working.
With me, it was working. I was able to install.
So it's probably because it's an Apple, right? You're having the same problem.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
We give you a spreadsheet.
But we also couldn't.
Let me see. I was able to use the serial number, but it was, I got the license here. Exactly. Then I did like auto registration, it was not working. Exactly. Then you have to, I completed also here the exact with the school. Or maybe there is nothing to the just security that they hide, you know. Yeah, exactly, you're right. Okay.
We can also do the following. We start. I show you the Eviews concept, and Alessandro gives you the R code, and we build the R code directly for everything. I did not want to do that because it take me too much time, to take me too long, but I think this also can be done. So the idea basically is, I will show you what I'm doing here. I'm reading the data, and there are two sets of data we want to read. The first one is the data we already looked at, or the institutional sectors. And then we want to read the data of GDP by expenditure components to get the deflators. Then what I've done
this tedious task that I've done and we can replicate now in R is to get the variables we want and transform these V's into our own notation. So this will be the net wealth of the government. This is the net wealth of the foreign sector and the net wealth of the private sector. So in R, we can start writing a similar code. So let me copy something from here. Let's start a new R program. So what I've copied is only the working directory, and I want now to read this file with the institutional sectors that we created earlier this morning. So in R, I learned that I can use, where is it? Import from Excel, right? Then I go to my folder, I choose the file. Now this file is not in the folder because I have created it this morning, but I've not shared it. So let me share this also in the drive. Okay, so the sheet I want to read is not this one, but it's what I call data. So R is getting the preview. Anyway, I think we can do without the preview because it's trying to get a preview of a huge number of data. Do I have to skip one row? No.
Depends how
There is the name of the variables are in the first row.
Then it begins with the numbers, then you don't have to skip any row.
Well, the first row is the, okay.
So then you don't-
First row has names.
Yeah.
Okay, open data viewer, no. Quarter is considered to be double, but all these are all wrong because they are read as logical, but they should be numbers.
Yeah,
Maybe-
that's because
Maybe logicals is only for those who are all empty, I think.
these are completely empty, right?
Yes,
Yes, and
some
then
are
it's
completely
fine.
empty. So it should be okay. Let's see if this is okay. Import. I said I did not want to. So I can now copy my comment from here to my program. No, sorry, I pasted it in the wrong place. Now, I don't want my data frame to be so long. So let's call this whatever, BD. I guess I can do that. And I want to have this same thing here, to use paste WD to the file name, so that you don't need to change anything other than the first line. I guess this can go. Okay. So let me call this program something, save as, no, now I have to distinguish the folders. So let me use the folders that we are sharing. And let's call this Mexico 28, the 28th of March. And I hope you understand that now that you download it, if you download it, you have to change this line to reflect the location of the data on your own computer. So that when you go to read this line here, it will merge your own folder name with the file name and read the data on your computer. Yes.
Can you show the whole file name again?
Cuentas institucionales.
Two at the end.
Two at the end. Let me make sure that it works. It works. It worked. So far, so good. Now, we have this data frame that we call BD with all these thousands of variables, 5,000 plus variables. We want to extract some of them according to the model that we decided to present, which was in the previous slides. So let's start from the variables in the balance sheet. And the balance sheet, maybe it was here. Yeah, in the balance sheet, we have the stocks of net wealth of private, government, rest of the world. And then we had bonds for the government, rest of the world, private sector, equities, and foreign assets. So we have to identify these variables in this huge file. And this is a lot of work that I have done. And basically, it consists in finding where the variables we want are located. So VG is 6,202. If I go to the data file, 62, let's check that this is still correct. 6202 is expenditure of the government total value. So actually, sorry, assets, total assets of the government. 6209 is debt of the government. And 6353 is the discrepancy. Okay. So here comes what I was telling you, that in principle, we should have that these are the assets in the data for each sector. These are the liabilities in each sectors in the data. So I can compute the difference between assets and liabilities, which is what I've done in here. And I should have that the sum of what I have for the domestic economy plus the rest of the world gives 0. So here I have I've made this calculation, and this is indeed okay, but not for everything. Or to put it differently, the
Gennaro, maybe we check that everybody's on track before we continue with some idea. At least the people, at least the one that has a running version of a studio. So we start with Brian.
Yeah,
So which point are you at?
well, I've loaded the data.
You have loaded the data, the sheet for data, and you have the data now ready to go on RStudio, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, not yet. I'm
I
working
am
on
just
it.
waiting for RStudio and legal.
So I just install Eviews and just track which file.
Okay, we have to load using the menu function the data called this BD Cuentas Institucional de Economía 2, and then load the second sheet, the one with data, and at least we have to the line. Benjamin?
Upload, import the Excel file, but what do you mean the second sheet?
In the second sheet, we have to select the sheet for data. There's an option to select the sheet for data.
When I export it.
When you import it, you have, you can just figure out that.
I'll just bring the pen. So I have it open here.
Okay, that's the easy one, but I have to say. Okay. So we have to import now.
That's strange.
You have to now browse for the folder called Berlin 2022. Do you have the latest version, because this file this file was from this morning, right? So we don't need the data. Thank you. Are you on?
I just imported the data, but my computer seems to be slow.
Yeah, because it's a large file. It's a large file. But it's a second sheet, right? So the one
Okay, and here,
it's called Cuenta for DG Cuentas Institucionales de la Economía 2. And from that you have to select the second sheet of the data. No, there should be a 2 at the end.
No, it's 2.
so don't-
Maybe it's the-
Here,
Yeah.
okay.
That's one, yeah.
Then,
Yeah. From 5 should work.
Okay, I'll go for 5 minutes break
yes, we will set,
and you finish the check.
right.
You can select only this one, who is one, only this one, or this one.
You select the line and press the Alt Enter with right click with the mouse. Advance selection. Version of
Okay. I think we should, everybody get to the point that at least we have the data ready to be further work with it. And then from there we can start again. And you can also take the output from Gennaro and change the BD to your working directory. Because he has like kind of left like a empty, so that we can change it according to our own system. From the other side, exactly there. Open the other file. Yes, exactly. And on top, right below, exactly.
It's already.
It's right there. Very good. What did I say? But then probably they have right.
Yeah, I thought so. So then here's one question. That did work. Regarding it looks very annoying that works. Okay, this would be annoying for them.
Yeah,
I completely don't know. It really doesn't seem.
we will find a solution.
I already collected data.
It's not, I think it just takes some time. And from then, what we have to do next, I try to run and I get an error because somehow it's within. In the setting of the time series was not correct. The data quarter is here field.
I didn't try that.
Oh, because we're trying to search.
But you can try to open the R on the computer so we see. I haven't been.
So he's talking about this data here.
Right.
And he's saying that
I'm pretty sure it
this
just.
part
Yeah, exactly. So we have.
since you don't have that column,
I don't know if it's actually.
it won't look the same way.
Yeah, so we are just doing.
Capital letters.
I don't know, because
I think it's because it's
it's
capital
not, so we see it's like in columns and not in the rows, you see? So you have the data in rows and not in columns. Because in this data, then it was referred to the student, so you have it here in columns.
Right, yeah.
And here you have like 2008, like rows.
Okay.
So it's another format, so I don't think it's not supposed to work,
But
I guess.
it works if you change it to capital letters, quarter.
I
Because,
think you have just imported the wrong
I
file.
think, yeah.
You have imported the first sheet, and you have to import the second one.
no,
The one called data, because it looks different in mine.
Mine looks like this.
I have,
ah,
exactly, mine too. It's a bunch of NA.
Yeah,
mhm.
and then you have to, some columns of the.
Yeah, it's the one we were preparing this morning with Excel.
Can I see?
Did you manage to do this?
No. Ah, yes.
Yeah, and then here, it's
Ah, okay.
capital
Then
letters.
it's
the first
capital
one, yeah.
It's written in capital letter, we have to change it. Do you remember, did we have to ask for admin permission to start R as a hardware? I don't remember anymore, but we did back then.
I think so.
We did, right?
I mean, you have the other.
No, yeah, apparently only for my computer.
They did it for me, and then,
Yeah.
then they gave me access to one folder where I was
Oh,
starting
yeah.
to install packages.
The packages.
To update it, so.
Yeah.
that's-
And so what's the stand about the stand? the current situation about Eviews. How many people have Eviews running?
I mean, I haven't put this old version.
In mind.
But in the latest version, I'm done. So yours and myself,
Yeah,
France.
Hopefully, yes.
But I said they don't do it, I think maybe they get back to it. Or tomorrow.
Yeah. And Ryan, did you manage to install Eviews?
No.
Because of the underground.
Yeah. I've sent the IT crowd an email.
I'm talking about for now, we just have to all the.
Yeah, I already had it for previous contacts.
I think we only have to. open the-
I think we have to be at the same level before we continue.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, but just open the.
Load the data, yes,
Yeah, load the
yes. So we are there, and then we can continue.
Yeah.
With explanation.
We already did 2 steps, like change the working directory for our computer, import the data set in the second sheet there.
Yes.
So,
This is simple.
So, set up. So, I know.
So what I was telling you is that you should not trust the data, but you should check the consistency of the data. So for the balance sheet published by Mexico, what they label as the sum of the assets and the liabilities is not the actual sum of everything they list as deposits, bonds, etc., because of this discrepancy. So if you do the check, you will find that there are these gaps. And this means that if you use the data as they are, you will have a variable which is a discrepancy. So I decided to avoid using the time series of the balance sheet for Mexico, but to do a simplification, which is to estimate the balance sheet time series from the flows, and also to have the discrepancy, which will be also in the flows, accumulate into the private sector net transfers, as we will see later on. So in order to estimate the balance sheet, I start from the first quarter for which data is available and get from the data the balance sheet of the government and the foreign sector and derive the value for the private sector. So this is done in Eviews in these lines, but we will now create the equivalent in R with the help of Alessandro, so that we are doing everything together only in R to begin with. And maybe I will use Eviews to look more quickly at the data later on. So we want to, we have read these V's. Now we want in R to create new variables. So I will simplify my job by copying these from Eviews and pasting them into my R code, but then I have to modify the code. So I want to create new variables that are taken from this BD data frame, but I want to create a new data frame. So how do I create a new data frame to begin with?
You start by typing the name of the data frame.
So let's call this MEX. And then what?
Then the assignment operator, which you can type with Alt minus, exactly that one. Then data.frame. Open parentheses, and then we have to start with the name of a column, then the equal sign.
The name of a column would be VG0 for my first variable.
And then is a numeric column? Yes, I suppose, right?
Yes.
So numeric.
VG equal, and now I can assign values to VG.
You can already start with
Yes.
numerical value, or if you want to have an empty place.
No, I have BD in my data frame.
Okay, yeah.
So I can see that this is V6202 less BD dollar V6209 less BD dollar V6353. So I guess that this will tell R that they are numeric.
Yes.
Can I already tell R that these are time series?
I don't think so. We just set this up later.
Okay, so
We can check with the structure of the, we can run the code, we can run line 33, just line 33.
yeah, I ran that.
Okay, and then
It
type
worked.
str max. And
Sorry?
it will tell you what. It's only numeric, right?
It's only numeric.
So we have to set this up with the flu package. Yeah,
But why do we need that?
because basically, I think what you're using is just numbers. It's numeric variable. So it's coming out just another numeric variable.
Mhm.
That's my best guess.
So what should I type?
It depends. I think you have to.
What input do you require for your next step? For the, does the time?
Well, I first want to create the model variables. Then I will need to extend these model variables for the future and tell R that these are time series. Now for the time series, I know how to do that. We can do that later.
Right.
So we can just start with the,
You should start with an empty data frame that is as long as you need it.
Yeah.
okay. So we can keep copying this type of lines for the other variables we need.
You want to add another column to the same data frame now?
I want to add all columns for each model variable.
Okay, then at the end of the line that you have just created,
Mhm.
that comma, and then go to a new line, hit enter, and then the name of the second column.
Okay, so second column will be this one. So basically, if you also want to speed up the process, you can open my mexico01.prg, which is a text file, and copy the lines and transform these lines as I'm going to do here. What I need to do is to drop this series and that BD dollar BD means from the data frame called BD, which I created here when opening the file.
Because in the original script was called data.
Mhm. So next one is VW. And then VP. Now VP 0, maybe I can create it later because it's not from the original data, but from the modified data. So this one, I think, would go in something like max dollar VP0 equal to max dollar, minus max dollar VG0 minus max dollar VW0. Right?
Yeah, you have to continue to use the same case, because one now it's capitalized and the other one is not capitalized. It's
You're right.
lowercase.
This also gave me the headaches because in Eviews, it doesn't matter whether you use capital letters or lowercase, but here it matters. So
Yeah.
let's always use uppercase letters. So this should work.
Whether the data frame should be capitalized next.
All right. Okay, so everything works. And we can continue with the other variables. So I hope you understand what this means. So this is BW0 is the starting value for the amount of bonds held by the foreign sector, public bonds held by the foreign sector. So I took line 6253 in the data, 6253 is here, is the bonds in the assets of the rest of the world, less I took the bonds in the liabilities of the rest of the world. So this is how I computed these variables. So I'm going to copy this and paste them in here. And now I will change the code so that it reflects the R specification. And I need commas at the end of each line, do we?
Yes.
Then again, this one is computed from modified variables, so it has to go in here and refer to max. So this again is these are computed from the existing variables. FL okay. So this should complete our spreadsheet variables for the starting values. Now comes the tricky part, but not yet. In a few minutes, we'll have the tricky part. The same here for the NAFAs, in the net lending of each sector. We want to specify them from the data. So V3919, V3920, forgot some commas. So far, so good. This is going to be the DPW's the flow in the bonds bought by the foreign sector. Was V4109.
There is a V missing in line 41.
Yes, thank you.
Over there is a V missing.
And this should go here at the bottom. Okay. Then we have the change in equities. 4269. Okay. Now these are all derived from the other variables. DFG. Okay. Now let's check whether all of this works. I think I have an extra comma in here.
Like the
FP0, FL0,
FG0, there was a problem there.
well, I can look at FL0. FL0 is filled.
Because FL0 is filled in line 55, right?
Right,
And the problem is with FG0. Probably.
FG0,
Yeah. It's there.
there.
Oh, this is okay.
Yes, FG0 is defined later.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now it's clean. Okay, now things get more complicated, and I need Alessandro, because what I need to do is to cumulate the flows to the starting value of the stock. So what I do in Eviews is a simple alphanumeric loop. So in Eviews, you can have a loop where you assign to the alphanumeric variable called var the values of this list. And then you ask Eviews to create a new series. The new series has to have the name in the list, one at a time, and it has to be equal to the same name ending with a 0. So here we have created all the zeros, which are the starting values. So this is rather simple to do also in R. But then what I don't know how to do in R is that from the next period, you want to take the starting value, the previous value, add the flow, and compute the next value. So this is basically working row by row in R and saying take the previous value in the same row plus another value in another column and compute the new value. Do you know how to code this?
you can create a loop that goes by rows that select at every row the previous one. So you index the row.
Can we create a loop with these variable names, or should we repeat the loop for each of these variables?
Okay, I didn't understand exactly what you have to do here with this variable. So basically you have these variables is something that we already have, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you just want to change the name of this variable?
No, I create a new variable.
Yeah.
Uh,
With the name and
to avoid any confusion. So in the first period of the sample, for the first row of my data, I copy the starting value from these zeros, okay, from these starting benchmark values. Then I move to the second row and I say for each column, take the previous value, the previous row, and add the value in another column.
All right.
Using these formulas.
Yeah.
So this will accumulate into VG the values of NAFA G. So the net lending of the government accumulates into the net assets of the government.
Yeah, so we start, first of all, we need to create, again, an empty space where to save all this data.
All the data we need are now in this MEX.
You need to define first the names where you want to store them.
Exactly, and a placeholder, what we need now.
So,
So we need probably another data frame, which has, let's try with a simple case first. So we simplify one column and how many rows? 55 rows.
No, it's less. For doing this calculation is less than 55, because you only need them for the stocks, which are, I think.
Okay.
is it the same length as next? Data from next?
The length of the rows, yes. The other trouble is that these data do not start in the first row, but they start in the fifth row.
That's no problem. Because
So isn't it easier to convert this into time series first?
I don't see now the need to use the, as long as we sum row by row, row after row, I don't need now the need to,
Okay.
to sum it up by row.
So what would you suggest? Because what I want to create. So let's start with the first one, is VG.
Yeah.
So I want a new variable that I think I can still place in
Yes.
my max data frame,
Right.
called VG,
Yeah.
to be equal to max VG0 for the first row. Well, it doesn't matter if I just say equal to VG, as long as later I change the rows from 6 to whenever.
I would first create a column called VG that is as many rows as the other columns. So it would be like.
So this is what this has already done that.
Yeah, we can overwrite this one. Exactly.
Yes.
Then we can, and the first row, the first element in row 1 will be has to be equal to VG0, right? Exactly. We cumulate for them.
Yeah, let me show you that this is not exactly what we have, because
Just without show, just
sorry.
type head, just head, and then next. Exactly, next is because it shows a bit less of data. Yeah. So these are the first 5 suits. And we want to accumulate them, right?
Right. Let me just check one thing, because I was not sure that they were there. But I think they should be here.
Yeah.
Okay, so now what?
Okay, so basically what we want to do, I try to describe in words what we are doing. So we keep the first element,
Mhm.
38,000.
Yes.
As that. The second one would be the sum of 264 plus the previous one. This is what we are doing. right?
No.
Okay. Then
How do I show two variables in two columns?
And then we have to open the max data set by clicking on max on the right hand side. Yeah, yes.
So we have for what we're working with VG. So this is the column for VG, and we want to use this NAFA G as to be added to the previous value of VG. So basically, sorry, this is my formula here. So the next value of VG should be equal to the previous value plus the value in the second row of NAFA G.
Okay.
And this should be done for all rows.
So we can start with the for loop now, I think.
Okay.
And for open parentheses,
Normal parentheses,
normal
yes.
parentheses, an element we call I, an index. In we want to keep the first element as it is, right? So
Yes.
from 2 colon. Yeah, now then how many rows we have? 55, from 2 to 55. Then open curly braces. And go to a new line, go to another line, and then go to 60. We have max VG, open square bracket, I, and then we assign this with the assignment operator. So what we're doing is max VG0, so $sign VG. And
So
the
it should
first
be-
element, right? So we have now to index the element that we need.
Can we do I minus 1?
Yes.
Okay. Then plus max NAFA GI.
I.
Okay.
That should be the trick.
Now, either I copy this for all stocks we want to accumulate, or we do another loop, as I was asking you earlier,
By column.
by
I don't know how
column.
to do that. There is a package
Okay.
to do that, and I don't remember now the program.
Okay, so it's just, let's see whether this works. Looks like it worked.
Yeah.
Let me.
We make this.
And then we can loop over there.
And loop
And
over.
inside that we loop over I. That's the loop over.
Yeah. Would you try to try?
Can I try writing this?
Sure.
Sorry?
Sure, try it. By the way, I'm saving this file as Mexico 28 in the shared folder. So if you want
I've
to,
seen that. Great. So we were.
I'm not completely sure if it will work, but let's try. So we should be. How do
you
we?
want uppercase max?
Yeah. And how do I do? No, sorry, I have a Mac. That's
The square bracket?
yeah.
Square bracket is here.
We were
Okay.
right.
So IJ. So then we can loop over two things.
Mhm. But it's not for all columns.
So I would be the rows and J would be the
I
columns.
understand, but they are not necessarily where you will expect to find
Do
them.
not use a capital P.
So you cannot do this for all columns. If you look at
Okay.
the max, if you look at the max data, these are here and the NAFAs are here. And not necessarily what you want to
Yeah, I
look at.
see. You need to
So you
really
either
specify.
identify the columns or
And then I
There's
do
nothing you can
And
do.
then, yeah, okay,
No, you just have to copy the same comment.
yeah, then you have to copy
Everything.
this line.
Yes.
Do it for A. Yeah.
Okay.
If you want, I can
Not too
see
bad.
how to do it in Dplyr, or you find the solution.
No, that's not.
I can look it in Dplyr, it's faster.
Anyway, it's not going to take that long. So we have VW and NAFA W. VP and BW BW B and BP.
Or you do it by hands, do it like this.
There are not too many.
Yeah, okay, then. But I will maybe later this evening I will look for.
Now, if you find a solution, it would be very helpful.
Yeah, there is, of course. Doesn't come now naturally.
Okay, the equities, e.g. E.g. EW and E. And last one is FL, FG, and FP. Okay, so hopefully this should work. Okay. So now another a little tricky part is the earnings from financial assets. So what I've done here is what we usually do in this type of models is so we have identified that bonds here is the public bonds. So I take the interest paid by the government and call it interest on bonds. And then I divide this interest paid on bonds by the opening stock of bonds to get the bonds received by the private sector and the bonds received by the foreign sector. And again, here, if we had time series, it would be straightforward. May not be so straightforward with the current setting. So again, I'm copying this to R. First part has to go up here. So it would be INTB equal to BD dollar V1306. And this part goes to the bottom after we have computed the stocks. And again, here, if I understand Alessandro, what Alessandro showed me is what I want is INTBP to be equal to the variable I have INTB times the variable I have for BP, but for the previous row. So how do I identify the previous row?
You have to,
I have to go through the rows.
you are creating the interest in BP
Yes.
variable, so we have to do this inside the for loop. Because the for loop is what automatically is filling the rows. What is?
Okay, so I have to do another loop like this.
Yes.
Just to be sure. And in here, this goes inside the loop. And here I have to specify I. And this will be I minus 1 and divided by the total stock of bonds of the previous period. While this simpler okay, so I hope you understand what I'm doing. So basically, I want an implicit ex post interest rate on bonds. I have the million paid by the government on bonds, and I have the opening stock of bonds. So I'm computing implicit interest rate there is a message from the chat. So we fixed that. Let me save this again. What was the problem with this?
Was defined
Yeah.
not in the right order, so there was looking for something that was
Yes. Okay, so let me run everything again. Oh, I forgot a dollar sign somewhere.
You probably didn't create a variable int dp to begin with, like the placeholder. So the variable is like where the data are going to be stored.
Okay, so how do I do that?
$sign and int dp.
And that's it.
No, we have to say how long.
Equal null, you can just equal and then null.
Exactly.
Capital letter.
Equal?
Null. And you capital.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
It does not have the length, right?
No, but now the error is BB with BW because we are forced to create. In B was already there, right? From the max database.
Let's complaining about BW. Int B should be in a database.
Yeah, complain about BW. It's complaining about BW because one of the elements that we use to compute BW is not existing. So
BP is not existing. B, int B works.
it's there.
But BP is not there. TMP.
We don't have a null for int b, right?
The first value should be not available. Maybe it's complaining because this is not available.
Instead of null, you can
I think exactly it's null, it sounds a bit. But why don't we simply say numeric and then
But why don't we simply move everything to time series? Because time series and BMETs, I just write TS lag, time series lag, and it solves everything. And I can also specify the sample to apply to make the computation.
yeah, but that's not so straightforward now.
Why not?
Well, the way I work it out is to think always in terms about of what I want to store and which format. And then if it's time series, it comes later because then I will give a time series structure that I can use for econometrics or plotting. Otherwise, I just consider the information as raw data or categorical variables, factors, whatever they are. I mean, this I believe is the philosophy of R.
But yeah, the R was not meant for time series.
Yeah.
But what if I try to have a data frame max TS and max TS as a TS of max?
Yes, object. Yeah, for sure. It could work.
You have to write STS, I think.
And then start equal, this should be what? 2008.1 frequency. Why don't you give me the help anymore? Start equal but why doesn't it give me the quarters here?
Can you check structure of the data set now that
Let me try something else because this is a time series from BMETs, which
You can use the standard and add the column there.
all input data must be numeric.
Yeah, because the next database contains a bunch of variables that were defined as a logical one with any, remember? So I think that we cannot transform that. This is.
They were not numerical, they were
They were
missing.
numerical? Okay, then it's strange.
Logical.
So, but max, yeah, max is the set we already
Okay.
restricted.
All right, true. Yeah, the BD was.
BDA was full of
Right,
rubbish.
Right, yeah.
Max should be cleaner.
Actually between, okay, then it says, all input must be numeric.
But what if we start afresh and we try this after we have at this stage, because in here we have created some missing values, etc. So
Okay.
if I restart everything from the beginning, clearing everything, reading my max variables, everything is fine up to here. No.
Fine, this looks. Yeah,
These are all numeric.
it's all numeric, yeah.
Maybe it doesn't take
Does it take
the whole data frame.
exactly, doesn't take as an input the data frame. Let me check.
Should we find the-
Can I go by column with a for loop for all columns in max?
So what you want to do is transform each object in a time series object,
Yes.
right? There is the apply function for that.
And how does it work?
Yeah, that's. Okay. So what we want to do is now to apply the same function time series
To each column of max
to each column
and put the
of
answer in max.
max.
Yes.
Okay. So we can.
But let me check, first of all, if this works for a single series. So if I want to do this for
Exactly. That's
an alpha p, no, it complains that I don't have a MEXDS.
Okay, with the original, okay, and then it works. Okay. Right. You're working the two. Okay, and this is recognized now as a data frame with time series. Interesting.
I guess so, I'm not sure, but it looks like it.
Okay, so we see
Because what I was doing here was to use this, but this is inside BMETs, and I converted each time series to a time series, but inside a model object. So it's not exactly what we want to do here.
They have used, instead of the time series function, they have used the TS function,
Uh-huh.
and it was working here.
With TS,
Yes, instead of time series. So it's low case, small case. Yeah.
well, I don't have this.
Yeah.
But if I don't have the data frame, it should work. Yes.
Exactly. Now,
Okay, no,
Right,
it
and-
works like this.
exactly as year with the quarter,
Hmm?
we are going to year.
This 2008 first quarter up to the end of the data. So it ends third quarter of 2021.
Okay, can you show this knock up again from the beginning?
This one?
Open it maybe in this, I know, exactly. Ah, okay, oh, this is like this.
Yes.
Okay, fine.
So the only thing we need to do is to have a quick way to replicate this command to all this, but possibly I can do this when I read the data from here. So instead of having VG equal BD, I can have VG0 equal TS, etc., or not. This was my starting question. Otherwise, we have to create a new data frame for the time series.
But can we not try again to convert this next data frame to as a whole?
With TS,
Yes,
by saying that this is
max TS. for example.
max TS
Then
as max.
the whole max. What does it happen?
Yes. See, it worked, but it doesn't give me the quarters.
Because you have to create them, yeah, as they did.
Okay,
Yes.
I think I have something like that.
And can you suggest it?
Yes, when you, it was the first row you had, the name BDS for the name quarter as year quarter, open parentheses. And then
So I have to have max TS, and then I create a variable.
Do you already have, no, you don't have the quarter variable yet. So first you have to create the variable quarter,
Right.
and then
This,
so as year, as dot year to
as year QTR.
UD. No, you call, because I'm using the data frame UD. And I'm calling the quarter from there.
Let's,
Okay, so
let's
there
use,
was already a value. Okay,
Yeah.
so we can do like this. First, we merge.
no, but BD should be okay.
Yeah.
BD
Quarter.
Okay.
Yeah,
quarter.
and then you have to merge the
All
quarter.
right.
And do I need some format, or is that,
And then, no, it's okay, but you don't need to put the MXTS with the dollar symbol, it's just quarter should work. Yes, and then.
but this is not going to tell me that all my, they wanted this to have,
yes, sure,
You
yeah.
bind them later.
Yeah, that
You
was
have
gonna
this-
make,
yeah,
yeah,
you merge them together.
yeah, I
later.
merged it together, sure,
In this way, it's good to understand.
yeah.
warning, cursing left-hand side to a list.
Yeah, maybe then you have to merge it too.
Maybe then you have to multiply them.
Yeah, you have to create the variables first and then make.
Now this has somehow destroyed my max.ts data frame. It's become a list.
So the way I did it was just to rename
Mhm.
the quarter and then create another data frame that merge the next TS with the quarter.
Exactly. So basically, to a new row, like row 53, and then there is a new name that we can give, like XTS1,
For what?
and then we, she suggested, we then merge next yes and the time index.
So merge,
No, it's not.
First, we have to give a name to the new object that we want to,
And also rewrite it, right?
or overwrite it, yes, or to the next yes, yeah.
So next, yes,
That is a data frame. Data frame? No, it's data frame.
it's already a data frame.
Yes. No,
Merge.
No, data frame. No merge.
Data frame.
Data frame. And then like parser. And then next one. Next yes.
And it should work as well.
Great. Okay. So let me check now if I has to plot next yes dollar whatever BW. No, didn't work. It's not taking the dates for the axis.
But I think also we have to.
Because quarter is not a time series, right? And then- and that's the first argument with the.
It lost the structure of time series that had in here. So everything up to here was working. The only thing we needed was to add the date index. No, it's not working actually. No, I don't know where we are. So I think that this was working, but without just displaying the quarters, but now it doesn't look like it's working. Let me clean up.
But why don't, my question is, why now do we need it necessarily to give the time structure to the data?
So that I can use the
lag operator.
lag operator.
I argue that this is not necessarily strictly necessary in R. And for example, I never use this, and so we have to continue to create new variables, right? So that's what we want to do.
Okay, so forget about this. We'll worry about this later. And we were in here, but we did have a problem with identifying, with understanding how to compute this interest rate. So let me rerun.
Exactly. When this code was working, I think
Up to the last lines. Okay.
First, I wouldn't use the number, the null, but I would call this numeric.
What?
Instead of null, I would type numeric. Take a small case letter, exactly 55. Then the question is, what is the first element in this vector of 55? Because
Is NA. NA is not
NA,
available.
and then we have to define that. Then you go to a new line, so like make a exactly.
We'll have the length already.
So this should be 1.
Then open square 1 exactly equal NA.
Just an A.
Okay. let's look at this. Okay. Okay. Okay, so this is how we go for the interest payment, so we can resume what we were doing. And we still need to have dividends. Well, we're almost finished.
The dividends and
So dividends. I think they can go up also in here. These are what I had from the conversion of dB. With dividends, now interest on foreign assets is the same.
one is dividends on, you have two types of stocks.
No, the point is, yes, we have dividends going to the government and dividends going to the rest of the world.
Okay.
So yeah, this is also interesting, because what I've done for the implicitly for the bonds is to assume a common interest rate paid on bonds and compute the interest payments by multiplying this implicit interest rate to the stock of bonds held by the private sector or the government. Now, I try to do the same for the dividends. So I have the equities held by the government, equities held by foreigners, and I have the dividends paid abroad and the dividends earned by the government. And if you divide the dividends earned by the government to the stock, it's basically zero. So basically the government is not getting anything on its equities, and only the foreigners are getting. So I decided to compute two different rates of return on equities, and we will see them a little later, I think. Yeah, this is only the beginning. We have not finished yet with this model. So I have them here. This has been done. So yes. Thank you. So we need interest paid from abroad we go here. And here I also forgot a V.
Yeah.
I think my V is not working as it should. And these have to be computed at the bottom of the code, as we did for this interest. So again, we will have these Same thing here, int fp is numeric and empty. And here fp is given by f times fp minus 1 divided by fl. I drop the f from the side. And this int fg will go down here. Okay. Then, well, this is rent that I thought it may be interesting. And this is part of government accounts. These are social contributions. These are pensions. Taxes. Thank you. And government investment. Okay. Now, we're not interested in this, but I told you I was using another page. Let's check whether this still works. Yes, this has copied everything I need into this new page. We should be on the same line in here and in R. We haven't looked at these things at all, and actually I haven't. We will need to merge two files as well. We didn't do that yet. So do we want to also, well, let's go through this other problem to be solved in R. We will continue creating variables later, and this is what is recorded in my Mexico #2 program. But now we no longer need the original series. We only need the series we already created in the file. So we want to do two things. First thing is we will need to read the file for GDP data. I haven't showed you this file yet. So I'm just going to close a couple of files we don't need.
This is
And
GDP OECD, right?
GDP OECD. So, you know the accounting at constant and chain prices. So basically, this is GDP, consumption, government consumption, total investment, exports, imports, and a GDP residual for data at current prices, and the same for data at chain prices. And here I also have GDP from the income side, compensation of employees, and gross operating surplus, and net indirect taxes. So we want to read this data into R as well. And we have an additional problem, which is that the other data starts in 2008, but this starts in 2007. So we have 4 more observations, and it would be a pity to drop them because they are useful to compute annual growth rates for these variables. So we need to understand how to work with data in R, which starts from different time periods. And again, if we convert this to time series, it's relatively straightforward. But if not, then we might have a problem. But I guess that we can just create a new data frame for these variables, and we will worry about the merging later. Okay. So let's keep consistency with what I do in my Eviews file and what we do in R. So in my Eviews file actually started from this GDP. So I guess that in R, we will want to go to the top of our code, and we modify this line for BD, and we can type, let's call this GDP, for instance, GDPD, to read the file, which is GDP OECD, yes, GDP OECD XLSX. So we also have this additional data frame, and then we will worry. Well, sheet is not called data. How is it called? It's called foglio uno in Italian. Sorry about that. But if I drop the sheet equal, it should work anyway, shouldn't it? New names.
Yeah, basically it says that there was a variable that had no names and was called 1. Yeah, the first one, year.
Okay, that's the quarter.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have our file, and we worry later on how to merge this with the data on institutional sectors. So we successfully replicated my first Eviews file into R. What I can already do here is to look at some feature of the economy, which is actually what we want to be looking at. So this would be the public debt to GDP. So this is the stock of public debt in Mexico over GDP. Is this correct? This is saying this is 200%. No, it's not correct, because the stock is a measure at a point in time, but the GDP is a flow. So these, if I'm not wrong, these are quarterly figures for GDP. So we should multiply GDP by 4 to have an annual equivalent that can be compared to the stock. So if I'm not wrong, the true debt to GDP measure is less worrisome than the previous one. It's divided by 4. So this is another story that you should keep in mind when working with quarterly data in stock flow models. When you compare stocks and flows, you sometimes have to divide by 4 or multiply by 4. Let's look at the what we called VW. VW is the wealth of the foreign sector, and therefore the debt of Mexico with foreigners. And so this has been growing up to 12% of GDP, and it started to fall only with the pandemics. So this is the kind of initial data analysis you want to run to understand what features of the model you will need to explain. So we can look at, for instance, real GDP, which is I call GDPK. And here we see that this is seasonal. As I told you, I decided to keep the unadjusted figures. It has been growing over time, and one way to quickly look at the different periods is to take the annual growth rate. So the annual growth rate eliminates the seasonality from the data, but the point is that the COVID crisis implied a too large a shock and made the other data collapse so that you could not really see what was happening. So now it's clearer that after the Great Recession, the Mexican economy was, doing much better than other economies like Italy, but still fluctuating around 3% in real terms, growth in real terms of about 3%. So our model over this sample will be dominated by the Great Recession and the COVID crisis. And if you have any experience with econometrics of time series, you already know that this is a major problem. Why? Because in econometrics, we want to estimate parameters on the basis of how one variable changes relative to others. So if you want to explain how GDP growth is changing, you have very small change from 2010 to 2020. You can take out these periods. If we take out the Great Recession and 2020, what you can see is that there is a small decline, slow decline in the growth rate with small fluctuations. It's not so easy to explain a series with this small volatility, especially if in the full sample, the volatility is dominated by the Great Recession on the one hand and the COVID crisis on the other. And the other problem is that for the Great Recession, we don't have enough data previous to 2009 to help us understand the extent of the recession. So if we had another 5 years of data, we could hope to be able to explain the decline in here. It's going to be more difficult without a longer time series. Other than that, if this is completely explained by the fall in exports to the United States or in other exogenous determinants from an external shock. Okay, what was the last thing we wanted to look at? Maybe we may be interested in the EW is the foreign direct investment. These are equities held by the rest of the world. And this is the second quarter of 2020. So this is not a jump in the equities bought by foreigners, but a drop in GDP, which makes this series jump up. And again, here the seasonality is given by GDP rather than the stock of equities. Okay, so these are a few of the things we will want to explain. The other thing we may be interested in is the NAFA-W over GDP, which is the inverse of the current account balance. So when this is positive, it means the current account balance is negative. And so Mexico has on average a 2% deficit in its balance of payment, which also explains why its foreign debt has been slowly growing over time relative to GDP. Okay, so once we have done that, let me show you what else we are missing. Don't know where we were on my slides. Yes, I was still also looking at the data, and one of the things I checked was the change in the stocks and the flows to estimate the net capital gains. So this is the change in, you can look at it in here, because one of the series is the balance of payments. Let's put this as a negative value. And the other one is the change in the stock of foreign assets, net foreign assets over GDP. No, this is not, I already adjusted this, sorry. This is what you get from the data is this chart in here. And the orange line is the balance of payment. And the blue line is the change in the international investment position. So the difference between the two are net capital gains arising from appreciation of foreign equities or changes in the exchange rate of the peso against the dollar. So this is telling us that you can get millions of pesos by betting on the exchange rate or on foreign assets in Mexico. And if these are so large, it would be interesting to extend the model to take this also into account, which is again something that we can try to do later. We already discussed this, seasonality, we discussed this. I showed you that in the Mexican GDP, there is a discrepancy. Now, this is not because they are lazy, but because GDP always has a discrepancy, and most countries put that into the change in the stock of inventories. So the change in the stock of inventories in principle will be a great economic variable because it signals the discrepancy between supply and demand of goods that can be stored. So if it goes up, then the demand has been lower than the supply and the other way around. But in the data, it's simply whatever doesn't match among the different estimates of GDP from the income side and the demand side goes in there. So it has this noise. Now, Mexico apparently keeps the noise out in a separate variable, but in this simple model, I've added the discrepancy to the gross capital formation as other countries would do. I told you about the procedure I use for interest payments. And I also told you that we will want to separate government investment from private investment. But to do that properly, we also need to estimate public investment at constant prices. And therefore, we will need a deflator for investment from the GDP accounts. And finally, temporarily, we simplify the accounting by putting everything which is not explicitly treated in a model variable in these net transfers. And this is the algebra of the net transfers in our simple model. And it must make sure that the sum of the three transfers is 0, so that the net transfers among the sectors are 0. And this is usually where you suffer the most in building your own model, because you have all these accounting identities that should match. You build the accounting part of the model, then you simulate the model only with the accounting, something we will do tomorrow. And you want that all the model variables are exactly replicating the data, and therefore that your consistency is complete, and this never happens. So these are these checks that you have to run, and that gets you mad until you find where your mistake is. And we will need to estimate deflators and ratios, but we are going to go through that now. If you are tired, we can take a break, but basically what we need to do is to complete this translation of Eviews code into R code. And I think I may be able to do that hopefully in a simple way. Or at least I can try. So I can try to use the search and replace. But then I also need to capitalize everything, which is not going to be so straightforward. Okay, so try to work from here. I have too many Macs around. Okay, so this is gross value added given by GDP. Oh, because all variables in R are in capital letters.
But I will understand that also. I know,
No.
we already have this pattern.
Yes. Now we will have some problems because now these are all related to the GDP.
Yeah, you can go to the database there.
Yes, this is going to be troublesome because now we're mixing the database. Okay, so this is not going to work as I hoped. So let's move to R. and see what we can do, because
You can also use here the search interface function.
yes, so now these are not maxed, but there should be GDP, what they call GDPD. But now we have a problem here because this is from the national accounts and this is from the institutional accounts, and we have to fix this. So I need Alessandro. Alessandro, the time has come for us to merge these two data sets, taking the dates into account. So,
And we're gonna match them like one next to the other, one below the other, one next to the other.
one next to the other.
Okay.
So the point is, our first data set is now this GDPD, and it contains 59 observations.
Right.
Then this next one, which we call BD and also max, will contain only 55 observations.
Right.
And we have to skip 4 rows. So we have to add 4 rows at the top in order to match them with the GDPD data frame.
Right.
But first of all, I guess that when R is taking all this data into memory, it will slow down. So can we drop this data frame after we have used it?
Yes, if you want, you can remove that. RMBD. You can type RMBD in the console, for example.
So in here, you can do RM
Open parentheses.
BD,
Yeah.
just to save
And then
save
execute-
space.
Execute the line.
No, yeah, okay, well, when we run the program. So how do we achieve this merging?
First of all, we need an identifier, so a variable that is the same in both database, otherwise R cannot find and cannot match them. So once we have that, there are functions from a package called dplyr that plays NA where it doesn't find a match.
So, well, we can create in GDPD, I think we do have this variable here with the dots, but we don't have an equivalent in here.
Right.
But anyway, we can simply create a series in GDPD, which starts from 1 and ends in 59. So how do I do that? It's GDPD
Call ID,
Goal
for example.
ID.
start 1:59
1,
and doppio punto.
59, like this. Okay, and for max, I can do the same max dollar ID, and this would be 559,
5:59.
like this.
Yeah, with the low.
Okay. And then how do I merge now max and
Could you try
GDPD?
to check that the line 33 actually works so that
Yes,
before doing that conditional? Yeah,
everything
So-
worked.
we have the identifier now. I would use the package, so I would install a package called the dplyr. So you go to the right hand side, the bottom right.
Yes,
keyword.
but let me remind here that I need to install. It's called what?
D
D
E
P
L Y R or Y R.
D P L Y R. Okay.
Yeah, this one.
Oh, I took it in help.
And you already have it, so you don't have to work up, you have just to load it. For the other that don't have it, you have to install this package.
Okay.
It's like the ABC of data manipulation. Important.
Okay.
So now we want to join the two
Yes.
database, one next to the other.
Yes.
How do we do that?
You tell me. I have no
Yeah,
idea.
I'm thinking. So there are 4 options. I think which one is the best now. Okay, let's try like this. You give a name to the new data, you call it next new, for example, or
Let's call
data
it-
next or new object.
Let's call it MD, Mexican data.
And the assignment operator. And then we need the left and the right. So the left is going to be, well, we decide it's arbitrary, I believe,
The first one is to be GDPD,
GDPD. And this is the one that is going to be shorter, right? Or
longer,
Longer.
longer.
Okay, so this is longer. Let's try the full. Then you have to use one operator that is called the pipe operator in R, and it's composed of a percent sign, greater, and percent sign.
Like this one.
Exactly like that.
With
And-
spaces?
Yeah,
Yes.
the space. And then you type full underscore join. Yeah, this one. And then inside the second database that we're going to merge.
Here it says X, Y.
Yes, and then comma by, because now we have to use, you have to tell R which one is going to be the variable that's going to be used as an index to merge. In quotation mark ID. We can try that to execute the line now.
Okay, so let's look at MD now.
Yeah.
Looks fine,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay. So now we have our MD. So we can remove everything else, and we can remove GDP D, and we can remove max. And we will only be working with MD from now on. right? So I can replace all these max dollar to MD dollar. And then we'll try whether everything works. Oh, here I was
That is the one.
still working on here, so this is not going to work. Okay, so let's check whether it works up to here.
Yeah.
Looks like it worked. 59 observation
Yeah.
on my 70 variables, so everything seems to be fine. So now I have to complete what I was doing here. So what I'm doing here is to compute the deflators. So this P in is the deflator for investment, and GCF is gross capital formation of the private sector, and this will be the gross capital formation of the economy less that of the public sector. I also need to switch all this GDP dollar into MD dollar. Okay. So this is computing private investment. This is computing private investment at constant prices by dropping public investment at current prices divided by the investment deflator. This is specifying a variable for public investment at constant prices. This will be the deflator of private expenditure. And actually, sorry, this is the PX is private expenditure as the sum of consumption, investment, and the GDP residual. This will be private expenditure at constant prices as the sum of consumption at constant prices, investment, private investment at constant prices, and the GDP residual at constant prices. This is total government investment as the sum of government consumption plus government investment. This would be IMD. This is total public expenditure at constant prices. This is the deflator of public expenditure. This is the deflator of exports of goods and services. The deflator of imports. The deflator of private expenditure. and the deflator of GDP. Now, we don't want all this max. Okay, I think we have finished.
There are a couple of things.
Yes.
Line 136. And another one in line 127. The deflator of private investment.
Okay, thanks. Okay. We're not finished yet. We still need to compute. Oh, only, well, still some variables. So again, here we need implicit interest rates. This is what I discussed before. So again, this have to be computed using a loop, I guess. And they will not be available for the first period. So let me copy the loop I used before.
There is also another way to do it without the loop.
Which is what?
It's again to using this DPLYR package,
Uh-huh.
but it's the same at the end.
Okay. So let's keep the same structure we had before. So now I want to loop from, I think is 6 to 59. Oh yes, we have to switch the numbers in the loops before we forget. So this would be RB has to be equal to int B divided by B of the previous period. And let me check what I just said. So let's look at the loops in here. So these are VG and alpha G. I think they all start from observation number 6. Alpha G starts at observation number 5. And VG is also available as number 5. So this loop will not work. I didn't assign a specific period in here. So this should go from 6 to 59. I don't know whether it's clear. We don't have data for the first 4 observations. And the same applies in here. We have data only from observation 5. So this would be 6 to 59. And these have to be number 5.
That's already
This I think it should be 1 to 5.
I think it's already NA because when we merge, this was automatically.
Yeah, this should be 59, not 55. We are creating these variables in here.
Additionally, okay, then it should be 1 to 5.
And does it work like this to create this?
Numbers going on
Hmm?
the last
last line.
It should work, yeah.
Okay. Now this is 6 to 59, this is 6 to 59. So now should be okay. I have to copy this to compute the implicit interest rate on foreign assets, which is int f over what I call in the end FL. The rate of return on equities to the rest of the world, which is the dividends goes to the rest of the world against the equities held in the previous period. And the same for the government. So this is net transfers which close the account. I have to capitalize everything. And this trick also makes sure that all the flow accounting gives the net lending of the sector. Now this is boring, but this is how you build the model.
Is this what is called the SFC check?
No, this is just the, yes, in a sense. We are writing the equations of the model that then we will simulate later to verify that everything works.
Okay, but not the check that I.
Okay, so this is another useful variable for the disposable income of the private sector. Oh, okay. Then we're almost through. We have taxes paid to the government on net indirect taxes, direct taxes, and social contributions. So usually you endogenize this according to the tax base. So for net indirect taxes, it should be GDP. For direct taxes, it should be the pre-tax income. And for social contributions, it's either wages or GDP. So these are, I call them tau something, so that in the list of variable names, all taus are all tax rates. And then when I want to do my analysis, I easily find their values in order to change them. So again, here I have to have everything up in upper cases. Why is this GDP lowercase? Ah, I see, I know why. Because in this file, it was lowercase.
Yeah.
So I have to switch to uppercase either in the file or somewhere else. I think it's
There is
easier.
a function in R that allows to do that. I don't know how to use it, but there is. Normally it's faster if you change the data set itself. The Excel.
I think so.
There is also might be also an Excel function here that does.
Uppercase.
Yeah.
So those of you at home online, switch the variable names in the file to uppercase. Okay, so this is done. I also need MD tau dt. Finally, SC okay, so I'm gonna save everything and tau SC has got a problem. Yes, here. I didn't see any other errors. So hopefully everything is working. And we're almost done. So we need to have also the modeling of prices. Now we have different deflators of the components of GDP for exports, imports, investment, public consumption. So it's usually easier to model this relative to the price, to the main price that we want to model in the model, we have in the model, which is the deflator of private expenditure. So we will define the relative price of government consumption, which is the deflator of government consumption. It's called PG, by the deflator of private expenditure, which is our reference price index, and the same for exports, and the same for imports. So we will need to model these variables rather than each price separately. Finally, I needed this, and this again needs to be computed over a loop. And this is basically a simple assumption to say that the issues of new equities from the private sector will be based on the GDP of the previous sector. It's not really a behavioral assumption, it's just a simplification for endogenizing in a simple way the supply of equities. Okay. Okay, so this work file is finished. And here we should be on the same ground. Oh yes, I needed to initialize this variable as I did for other variables. Okay. Why don't we have PG? Ah, I have a number of mistakes. So I think we were okay up to here. And we are not okay here. Yes, because this has to be GDP over GDPK. This is complaining that I don't initialize the variables. So I have to do whatever I did here. RB, RF. Okay, so now it should work. I don't know why it's complaining about PG.
Where did you define PG?
Looks okay to me.
Can you try to execute just line 136 again?
Where's this one?
Yeah, just that one. And there is a problem there. So one of the two is not defined.
GT and GTK.
GTK, okay. Yes.
So IMX somewhere. Okay. Oh, so this was the problem. So everything okay up to here. Great. So everything is fine now. So let's save. So now we have everything we want. And the next step is to build the model. So tomorrow morning, we'll start getting some fun with building the model. I think we can stop now. It's 5 o'clock. And I hope you didn't fall asleep in this.
In R as well with this iteration procedure?
We will use BMETs
Okay, yeah.
for the model. So what was missing was this construction of the data in R, because in R I already prepared this Mexico data file, but I didn't show you how I got to use that file. So maybe it was worth going through this boring process of taking the variables, building model variables. And now we should have the same things. We should have be on the same line on both softwares. Okay. Now, problem is with BMETs is that well, we can rebuild everything from scratch, because in Eviews I can easily add an equation, drop an equation. In BMETs I have to write the whole list of equations for the model, then load the data, then simulate. Then if something goes wrong, I have to go back and reconstruct. But we'll see how we proceed tomorrow. Okay, I didn't expect to go this far today. So we will have plenty of times to enjoy ourselves with enriching the analysis with something new, which is usually more fun than watching the professor reproduce what he has already done by himself. Okay, so we start at 10 tomorrow, Eckhart? Okay. And we can close here.
And the R file, the updated R file is already in the Google Drive, right?
Yes, I'm using that folder to save everything.